Good afternoon and welcome to Across the Fence. I'm Jolie Whitney. June is designated as Pride Month. Pride events are happening throughout Vermont, from Springfield to St. Albans. Pride celebrations have a long-standing history in Burlington, while other communities like Woodstock are celebrating their first Pride Festival this year. But what is Pride, and why does it need to be celebrated? And what does it mean for people outside the LGBTQ community? Our guest today is Reverend Dr. James Ross, affectionately known to the community. He serves as Dr. J. As the interim director of the Interfaith Center at the University of Vermont, Dr. J partners with the center staff and the broader UVM community to offer programming, resources, and space to support students, faculty, and staff as they explore, question, embrace, and live their faith identities and practices. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And as I just mentioned, you work with UVM's Interfaith Center. Can you tell me how that has to do with Pride?
Sure. Well, the Interfaith Center at the University of Vermont exists to promote religious pluralism. And by that we mean we want to create a space, a community, a campus where everyone can embrace and practice their own religious and spiritual practices, or none if that's what they prefer. And what we know is that people are not people have multiple have identities that are complex. So people who are people of faith also have gender, sexual orientations, races, all those things. And we try and work in a way that invites students and others to embrace and live all of those identities. For example, I am a person who identifies as a Christian. I am an ordained minister. I was a pastor. I'm also a black man and a person who identifies as part of the LGBT community. So we believe that this is a part of what we are called to do in our role at the Interfaith Center.
Absolutely. So kind of encompassing everything as well
Absolutely.
As faith. Absolutely. And Pride has a long-running history. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of Pride?
Sure. So Pride is officially marked as beginning back in 1969. So if you think about the 1960s, it was a time when there were really no protections for people who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. And at the Stonewall Inn in New York City, there were frequent raids and the people who were patrons there experienced a lot of abuse from police. On a day in June in 1969, the patrons, led by drag queens and transgender folks of color, as well as lesbians primarily, resisted. And there ended up being 3 days of what is being called the Stonewall uprising. So some people would say they were riots, some people would say they were resistance movements. The next year, there was a march to commemorate that, and that took place in New York, and there were also marches at the same time in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, and Chicago, and that was the first official Pride March. It's important to know that it was long before 1969 that people began doing work to organize around rights for LGBT people, but that is where we mark the beginning of Pride.
And you mentioned the acronym earlier. It's LGBTQIA+.
Sure.
For people who maybe aren't familiar with it, can you tell us what those letters mean?
Sure, and people use some sort of variations on those letters, but when we say LGBTQIA+, those letters stand for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. Q is used both for queer, which I'd love to talk more about, and questioning, meaning people who are sort of still thinking about what their identity is. I is a word that is sometimes used to refer to intersex, which is really not a sexual orientation, is a biological reality where people are born with what people would say is ambiguous genitalia. The term that used to be used was hermaphrodites, and that's not a term that we use anymore, but people may remember that term. And A would be for allies. So, and plus, because we continue to add to these, we want to be as inclusive as possible. I often use the term queer because it is a term that is more inclusive. It assumes everything when we say that. I also use that term knowing that it is a term that not everyone embraces, and sometimes is a generational divide, because certainly if we think back to, we talked about the 1960s, that was a time when the word queer was used very derisively. It was used in a way that was really negative, right? And now, like in many communities, that's a word that has been reclaimed, and just as in other communities, there's specific language that's been reclaimed. And so I use that term. I also realize that it doesn't resonate with everyone.
So kind of to follow up on that, some viewers maybe of different generations might remember that as being a derogatory word. Is it okay to call someone queer?
Yeah, I think that with any identity reality, it's important to ask people how they want to be referred to. I use that language as an inclusive term. I think that it is widely enough used now that most people, well, many people would not be offended when they hear it. And I also think that it is possible, whatever language we use, that we could offend someone, right? And we can't always control that. I think it's our intentions that matter. And when we have a misstep, what's important is to apologize, not make a huge deal of it, figure out what we need to do to move forward, and keep going.
All right, absolutely. And when we're talking about people in the LGBTQIA plus realm and issues around that, value is like a huge component of that. Can you talk about some of the values that you kind of use with the interfaith organization you work with? Sure.
So basically what we want to do is we value we think about the personhood of each individual, right? We think about the importance of inviting people to live their full humanity and their truth. And we also would embrace the idea of understanding that we can be in community together in ways that may sometimes involve conflict, but that means that our commitment to community means that we're committed to working through those. And we can have differing ideas about community and what is right and what is appropriate, and still find ways to coexist.
And let's talk a little bit about pronouns with they, them pronouns. Why are people choosing to use them?
Sure. You know, they, them often refers to people who identify as non-binary, although other people could use them if they choose to use them, right? We all choose how we want to be identified. But we've seen a rise in the use of the pronouns they, them over the past few years for people who don't feel that they fit squarely into the category of male or female. And I would draw a distinction there from people who are transgender, because typically when we refer to transgender people, we're talking about people who were born and assigned a birth. So told at birth they were male, for example, but discerned in the course of their lives that they didn't identify with maleness, and in fact were identified more with female identity. That's what we think about typically with transgender. With non-binary identity, typically people don't feel like they fit in either category. So the pronouns that we typically use would not fit, and so we see they, them as an alternative. I know that this has been a bit of a controversial use of language for some people because when we use they and them to refer to individuals, right? And people think that defies the conventions of English grammar. And I will be honest and say that even as much as I have been a part of the LGBT community and embrace and support people living their full lives, I struggled with that language to some when it came out, because for some of the same reasons. And then it occurred to me that people made the rules of grammar, right? So, and those rules are always changing. And we have to decide, do we value grammar over relationships? So is human value more important than some arbitrary rules of grammar? And also realizing that it is not really true that we never use a plural pronoun to refer to singular objects anyway. So.
And this kind of harkens back a little bit to what you were saying about the use of the word queer nowadays. If you're not sure or you have a question about how somebody identifies, is it okay to ask?
It's always okay to ask. I think that people are usually very welcoming of those kinds of questions, right? When we meet someone, we'll ask them what their name is, right? And it's become commonplace now to ask, so what pronouns do you prefer? You know, and some people, if you look at people's emails, they'll have their pronouns listed. And in the same way, it's always appropriate to ask, and how would you like to be referred to? Do you like the term queer? What is the language that you prefer?
And some people might find it hard to understand why somebody would perhaps identify with a different gender or would even want to use they, them pronouns. Is understanding an important part of the conversation, or can you still kind of engage in the conversation without knowing the experience yourself?
Right, I think that we sometimes over-determine the importance of understanding everything. There are lots of things that I don't understand in the world, but that doesn't mean that I can't support people in living that. Now, that's not to say that there isn't value in trying to understand. Obviously, there is, and there is something about proximity and getting to know people and their experience that helps to transform us and helps us to become different and to maybe go deeper with our knowledge. But I don't think it requires understanding to be able to support people. I don't understand how medical science works, but I do, you know, use doctors when I need to. So yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about the transgender youth community. What kind of hurdles are they facing in our community these days?
This is a very difficult time in our country for transgender youth and transgender adults as well, but particularly for transgender youth. For some people, transgender youth identity has become an organizing space, and it's been a place that people have used a lot of efforts to galvanize communities around, and often I believe in a way that is really intended to be anti-LGBT in general, but it focuses on youth. And it's really unfortunate and disappointing because these are like the most vulnerable people in our communities, right? But in some communities we're seeing LGBT youth targeted and not able to play specific sports in schools. We're seeing attacks on doctors and even families and parents about providing access to gender-appropriate medical care for children. These are all things that have a negative impact on children. And what we know historically is that LGBT youth and transgender youth have disproportionately high rates of suicide and other sort of negative impacts, and so this is not helpful. I am hopeful though, because we do see lots of support for transgender youth and transgender adults in our communities, and my hope is that that will continue to be the case.
All right, that's great to hear. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, thank you.
And that takes care of Across the Fence for today. My thanks to everyone behind the scenes here at WCAX who make this program possible. I'm Jolie Whitney. Have a good one and have a great Pride.